On the morning of November 15th, 2024, an attention-grabbing incident took place at Greenfield Veterinary Hospital when Stephanie, a middle-aged woman, brought her dog Max in for treatment due to respiratory issues. As the doctor asked her to wait outside while they performed tests, Stephanie could not contain her anxiety and tension, leading to uncontrolled behavior and an overreaction. The situation quickly escalated when she decided to call the police, resulting in a controversial arrest. That day, Stephanie could not sit still as she saw Max, her beloved dog, begin to struggle to breathe. Panicked, she rushed him to the veterinary hospital, her eyes filled with worry, clutching Max tightly as if he were her entire world. She had raised Max from a puppy, and now, seeing him gasping for air, she could not suppress the fear rising in her chest. Things began to spiral from the moment she entered the waiting room. A polite medical staff member asked her to wait in the designated area outside the examination room, as the doctor needed time to perform tests on Max. However, for Stephanie, her worry had overtaken any rational thought. She felt as though every passing second was a battle between life and death for Max. "Who are you to stop me from being with my dog?" Stephanie snapped, her voice sharp and high-pitched like a knife. Her face flushed red with anger and anxiety, her fingers clutching her purse as though it might steady her nerves. "Max is dying in there. Do you have any idea how worried I am?" Her voice echoed through the otherwise quiet waiting room, filling the air with tension. All she could think about was her dog's safety, and anyone who stood in her way became her adversary. The veterinary staff could only shake his head, tiredly explaining that the hospital's policy required the doctor to examine the dog before the owner could enter. Despite his patient attempts to explain, Stephanie, in her state of heightened stress, could not hear him. Her eyes widened, her fists clenched tightly, and her voice grew sharper, as if every word was a direct defiance of the rule. She could not stand the feeling of helplessness as she sat outside while Max, the friend she had known for years, was in the emergency room, possibly fighting for his life. "You don't understand anything. I have the right to be with my dog," she screamed, causing not just the staff member, but the entire hospital to turn and stare. Her eyes were filled with fury, her face taut with tension, her veins standing out as if they might burst. The sense of injustice in her exploded, and her fear for Max's health only fueled her panic. The other people in the hospital began to look at her with strange, cautious eyes, none daring to approach as she lost control. A short time later, as the situation continued to escalate, Stephanie decided to call the police. Her eyes gleamed with determination, her hands trembling as she gripped the phone. "You're all useless. If I'm not let in, I'll show you what abuse of power really looks like," she shouted into the phone, her voice thundering, causing the person on the other end to quickly dispatch officers. A wave of defeat surged within her, and calling the police felt like her last act of resistance, as if she needed outside authority to validate her struggle against what she perceived as unfairness. She wasn't just trying to save Max. She also wanted to prove that she wasn't powerless, even though she was facing an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Soon after, a police car with flashing lights came to a halt in front of the hospital, and two officers stepped out. Their footsteps were firm, but Stephanie's tension remained unchanged. As they entered the waiting room, the atmosphere in the hospital seemed to freeze. One of the officers, who appeared to be more experienced, glanced over the situation once more before approaching Stephanie. "What's going on, ma'am?" he asked, his tone calm but with a hint of caution, noticing the fiery, angry look in her eyes. Stephanie stood up straight, her eyes blazing as she locked her gaze on the officer, and before he could say anything else, she launched into an aggressive verbal attack. "I don't understand why I can't be with my dog. Who are you to stop me?" she yelled, her voice echoing through the hospital's stillness, as if trying to unleash all the injustice and desperation she felt. Her blonde hair fluttered lightly in the breeze, and her hands trembled incessantly, but the anger on her face was unmistakable. She resembled a cornered animal, and now, no one could stop her from regaining control. The storm within her had completely erupted. The officer stood motionless, his expression unchanged, but his eyes conveyed understanding. He slowly moved closer, keeping a safe distance to avoid escalating the tension further. "Ma'am, we just want to resolve this situation peacefully. "You need to be patient and cooperate," he said gently, his voice even, like someone accustomed to dealing with complex situations, unfazed by Stephanie's frustration. However, there was also a note of caution in his gaze. He had encountered many tense situations, but sometimes such agitation wasn't just anxiety. It could also be a sign of a loss of control that might lead to unpredictable actions. Stephanie continued to breathe heavily, her face flushed with rage. But now, she felt the officer's coldness counteracting her anger. She sighed, but remained defiant, unwilling to compromise while Max was still in danger. But Stephanie didn't listen. Her fury only grew stronger, like an uncontrollable fire. She continued to lash out, her tone sharp and filled with disdain. "You're all useless! What power do you have other than bullying people?" Her words were like arrows, shot straight at the officers trying to contain the situation. She stood upright, her eyes seemingly shooting sparks, her hands clenched tightly, as hard as stone. Her entire body was taut like a bowstring, each word she spoke adding to the suffocating tension in the air. The pressure mounted with every passing second, and a single wrong word could set everything ablaze. One of the officers, seemingly at his breaking point after enduring her criticisms, stepped forward and asked Stephanie to be quiet. "You need to calm down," he said, his voice even but betraying the fatigue of dealing with such a difficult customer. But the more Stephanie was pushed into a corner, the less she could control her anger. "This is an abuse of power. I haven't done anything wrong," she yelled, her voice crashing like thunder, causing not only the officers but everyone in the hospital to stop and look at her. Stephanie's whole body trembled, but not from fear. Rather, it was the fury swirling within her. Her hands clenched into fists, as though if she didn't make herself heard, no one would understand the injustice she felt. One of the officers, who seemed to be the leader, stared at her for a long moment. His eyes were filled with patience, yet there was also a weariness in them. It seemed like he had no other option. "You'll have to explain your actions in court," he said in a calm voice, but his words were like a final judgment. Immediately, the officer gestured to his colleague, and they began escorting Stephanie out of the hospital. She continued to scream, her eyes red with fury. She felt betrayed, as if everything was against her. With each step, each accusation she made, she felt more trapped, more forced to give in to a system she believed was entirely wrong. One of the officers, who seemed to be the leader, stared at her for a long moment. His eyes were filled with patience, yet there was also a weariness in them. It seemed like he had no other option. "You'll have to explain your actions in court," he said in a calm voice, but his words were like a final judgment. Immediately, the officer gestured to his colleague, and they began escorting Stephanie out of the hospital. She continued to scream, her eyes red with fury. She felt betrayed, as if everything was against her. With each step, each accusation she made, she felt more trapped, more forced to give in to a system she believed was entirely wrong. When the incident ended, the hospital announced that Max, Stephanie's dog, was not in danger and had stabilized. However, Stephanie couldn't believe it. She stood there, frozen, her eyes full of worry and doubt. In her mind, the image of Max gasping for air still lingered, and her fear of not being able to be by his side only intensified. The hospital's statement felt like a sharp blow to her protective instincts. "They're hiding something," Stephanie muttered, her voice tense and filled with anxiety. She couldn't easily shake off the fear that something was wrong, even though reason and the doctor's report contradicted her. Her worry turned into a fierce defensive reaction. "I did this for Max." "You don't understand anything," she repeated herself as if she were the only one who truly understood the situation. The next day, as news of the incident spread, Stephanie kept insisting she had been treated unfairly. She wasn't just angry about what had happened in the hospital. She felt society had turned its back on her. In every interview and statement, she maintained that she acted out of love for Max. Her eyes, still filled with dissatisfaction, stared at the reporters as if trying to convince them that her actions were entirely justified. "I'm a good owner. I just want my dog to be safe," she said, her voice firm, but with a slight drop, as if seeking sympathy. To her, everything revolved around Max, and what she had done was an expression of deep love, not an outburst of uncontrollable anger.